Hello, I'm Wayne Brittenden for the Political Compass podcasts. Our guest's Dr. Tilman Ruff, a physician and honorary principal fellow at the School of Population and Global Health. That's in the University of Melbourne, Australia. His specialty is infectious diseases and public health. He's long seen nothing ultimately more menacing to public health, indeed planetary health, than a nuclear war. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists have placed the hands of the doomsday clock closer than ever before to midnight. Tilman Ruff's tirelessly worked for many years on the need to eradicate nuclear weapons. He's long been a member of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. It won the Nobel Peace Prize back in 1985. He's now co-president of that organization, and he was co-founder of ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. ICAN won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 for heightening public awareness of the inevitable consequences of conflict with nuclear weapons. But Australia has just committed itself to spending at least $268 billion. $268 billion on a nuclear-powered fleet of submarines, a move that France's President Macron called a confrontation with China. Welcome to the Political Compass podcast, Tilman. Is President Macron right?
I think fundamentally it is. It's pretty clear that the whole purpose of this in terms of the public justification is for the supposedly escalating threat environment in the Indo-Pacific region, and a more assertive and expansive China. That's very clearly the target. And in fact, very specifically, if you look at what Australia needs, I mean, what is the strategic need that these submarines are planned to address, and what are the strategic implications of the decision? It really focuses on Asia. There's on Northeast Asia, more specifically. If you look at nuclear-powered submarines, currently there are 6 nations that have them. They're all nations with nuclear weapons. And there's a reason for that. The particular advantage of nuclear submarines from a military point of view, nuclear-propelled submarines, is that they can stay underwater for very long periods, essentially limited more by what the crew will tolerate than the mechanics. They can travel, therefore, very long distances. They can travel quite quickly, and they can stay submerged for long periods of time. That's particularly well suited for launching ballistic nuclear-armed missiles, and for essentially what most of the nuclear-armed states that have them seeking essentially to establish is an invulnerable second strike capacity, so that they have nuclear weapons on submarines in the deep ocean that nobody knows where they are, that would make them less vulnerable to a disarming nuclear attack, of a disarming first strike, and therefore act as a strong deterrent. And essentially most of the nuclear-armed states, except for perhaps some of the smaller ones, but really all of them are probably heading in the direction of having significant numbers of nuclear weapons on submarines for exactly that purpose. So why would a country like Australia, right at the bottom of Southeast Asia, small population, essentially invulnerable? The parliamentary committees that have examined over the decades the plausible military threats to Australia, until recently, and what's essentially in Australia now a really frightening warmongering talking up of the risk of war with China. 2 of the major daily papers, the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age in Sydney and Melbourne, our largest cities, last week had headlines with front page articles, essentially red alert, with pictures of a huge map of China in red with, multiple fleets of bombers heading towards Australia, saying essentially that war with China is imminent over the next few years. And that's the kind of rhetoric, unfortunately, that is being used as a basis, I think, to justify these submarines. So you don't need nuclear-powered submarines if the purpose is to defend the sea approaches to Australia, to the north through Southeast Asia. They're mostly pretty shallow waters. They're not ideal for very large nuclear submarine operation. Why you might want nuclear-powered submarines is if you want to operate them at very long distances away in the North Pacific. And essentially because these submarines and their core technology, both in terms of the propulsion and the weapon systems, will come from the United States, and both militaries are now talking up interoperability and increased enmeshment. The purpose really, from a military capability point of view, as any military planner in China or Russia or North Korea would see it, is that these are intended to act alongside US forces to contain and, if push comes to shove, to attack China. That's really the ostensible, I think, purpose of these. So I think Macron was right, and I didn't finish my comment earlier that parliamentary committees have examined until recently and agreed publicly that the only nation with the capability to invade and occupy Australia is the United States.
So essentially what you're describing is a marked shift for Australia's military policy away from defensive to offensive.
I think essentially that's right. The argument is that Australia is dependent on trade as an island continent, critically depends on its sea approaches, that the risks of a more assertive China rapidly building up its military forces, occupying islands in the South China Sea, not respecting International Court of Justice decisions about the illegality of that occupation and militarisation of those islands, more aggressive manoeuvres around Taiwan and towards Japan, and talking up the potential for a military takeover of Taiwan and reducing the sort of tolerance for talk of independence in Taiwan. The argument is that Australia needs to now be able to project power much further away from Australia to really, in the modern era, protect its sea lanes, its access, and prevent hostile forces from getting anywhere near the continent. But it seems particularly bizarre given that the very sea lanes that they're intending to protect are principally used for our second largest trading partner, that's trade with China. It's supremely ironic.
At the same time, the Australian government is talking about normalising trade with China. Australia is expanding its military ties with the US. How do you square that circle?
I think these are very inconsistent trends. What I would argue Australia really should be about is improving relationships with all its neighbours, investing much more in diplomacy and development, in meeting shared global challenges, of which we have enough, that are increasingly urgent. And yet we seem to have this essentially divergent, irreconcilable, dual-faced approach of we're happy for China to keep buying our materials, but at the same time they're our largest enemy. China historically has, I don't want to justify, many policies of the Chinese government or its possession and now rapid proliferation of nuclear weapons. But China has lagged in the nuclear arms race way behind the ones that have led, particularly the United States and Russia.
Well, between those two countries, we're talking about 80 or 90% of the world's nuclear weapons, aren't we?
90 plus of the world's nuclear weapons.
Oh.
China, just very recently overtook France, having the third largest nuclear arsenal, in the few hundreds, perhaps 350 or 400 nuclear weapons. It has not stationed any of those in overseas territories. It has not established a large network of military bases around the world. It has not intervened militarily beyond its shores. Its defence budget is a tiny fraction of the United States' military budget. It has not led on technological developments in nuclear weapons on any front. It's been the only one of the P5 nuclear armed states, members of the Security Council, to have a consistently stated policy of no first use of nuclear weapons, and it has none of its nuclear weapons on high alert. So a nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon. It's the most evil, indiscriminate and destructive weapon of mass destruction ever created, and it doesn't matter who owns them. That's their fundamental characteristic. They're unacceptable weapons. But China has not fundamentally been a driver historically of an arms race or an expansive, aggressive, imperial. It has not undertaken military adventures around the world. So I think that needs to be put in context when you compare that with the United States, for example, with close to 1,000 military bases around the world that has operated essentially unilaterally, militarily. China is now, and Russia and Ukraine, one could argue, are essentially now saying, well, we can play by that rule book too. We are major military powers. We are asserting the right to intervene militarily beyond our borders. And that is, of course, illegal and contrary to the United Nations Charter, but they're following a well-established playbook. I did a lot of work before he died in 2015 with somebody I never expected to, former Conservative Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser. And his great fear in the years before he died that he really, that racked him and he sought to get Australians thinking about was he saw coming the danger that a new Cold War, a new arms race would arise in Northeast Asia between the US and China, and thought that the Obama-era policy, which has been continued, of essentially building military and alliance relationships and force deployments, forward deployments, to contain China and seek to assert this unipolar world, was a recipe for war, with a high risk of escalating to nuclear war. And I think those predictions and those fears we're essentially seeing play out.
Interesting how Obama has something of a peace reputation, bolstered by your friends at the Nobel Institute, but in fact the Obama administration spent more on nuclear weapons than any other president.
Indeed, and if you look historically, it's been Republican presidents who have dismantled far more nuclear weapons than Democratic presidents in the United States. And I think particularly George Bush the elder bears a significant credit in history for the massive reductions, 30,000 weapons dismantled essentially after the end of the Cold War.
Those were the heady days of Glasnost, when we all had a right to expect a better 21st century than we're so far seeing.
Yes, and the price that the Obama administration paid for Senate ratification of the New START treaty, the last, limping along as it is, the Russians have now said we're not complying, we've suspended implementation. The last remaining constraint on US and Russian weapons that Obama managed to get through the Senate, but the price of that was, many argue, greater than the benefit, in the sense that essentially what he had to agree to was a probably multi-trillion-dollar refurbishment of the whole nuclear enterprise, with new weapons and launch platforms for the whole triad of ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, bombers and submarines, and all of the infrastructure and plants that produce them, that essentially has locked the United States into modernisation of its nuclear arsenal for decades, in a way that many argue is a far greater downside than the benefit of keeping rather modest constraints with an uncertain future on the strategic weapons of both sides.
It's almost as if, as the United States has lost economic power, it's played up its military power.
Yes, I think that's right, Wayne. I think many historians have argued that, empires are most dangerous when they're on the downward slide, in the demise, because essentially their economic and political power is waning, but what they still have to claim great power status and assert influence is their military might. And I think to a considerable extent that's what we're seeing with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, under cover of quite explicitly of impunity, claimed impunity, because of their status as having the world's largest nuclear arsenal. And I think that's a very dangerous trend we're seeing in the United States too, with this essentially refusal to accept the multipolar world that is already upon us.
Getting back to the home front, it's an irony, isn't it, that Australian taxpayers are playing a pretty important role in bankrolling American shipbuilding, and at the same time, the taxpayers are losing out because of the inevitable trade consequences with China.
I think you're right. There are massive direct and opportunity costs. This whole plan was developed in secret by the previous Morrison-Dutton government. The Labor opposition was given less than 12 hours notice of the announcement that Prime Ministers Johnson, Morrison and Biden made in 2021.
That's setting up AUKUS.
Yes, setting up AUKUS. Labor was given less than 12 hours for this, by an order of magnitude, largest military expenditure that the nation's ever undertaken, with huge strategic implications that even many of Morrison's senior ministers, even the foreign minister, were completely unaware of. Obviously had no parliamentary or public debate. A price tag that initially started at somewhere around sort of 100 to 110 billion Australian dollars. The figure that was announced in San Diego this morning, Australian time, was $368 billion. So, essentially pick a number and triple it. This is a staggering, stratospheric sum of money.
It's gobsmacking. It's
at a time
unbelievable.
When many Australians are facing serious cost of living pressures. Inequity in wages is continuing to rise. Many people doing it really tough. And each of the 20,000 claimed jobs that will arise from this program, if you split up $368 billion, it's $18.4 million per job of taxpayers' money, which is not available for addressing the climate crisis, addressing social equity, investing in health, education, environmental restoration, closing the gap of Indigenous disadvantage. All of the things that we really need to be getting on with.
All of the things that Labor governments are expected to get on with.
And all of the things that Labor at its best should be good at.
The ghost of Golf Whitman must be turning in its grave.
Well, yes, I've been thinking of that. In some ways, I'm glad that my engineer father, who worked for the Commonwealth government, isn't alive to hear this announcement. But it's been unusual to see former Labor and Liberal Prime Ministers, Paul Keating and Malcolm Turnbull, both unanimous in their condemnation of this plan, and particularly the loss of sovereignty that is entailed.
Because essentially, isn't America going to be calling the shots, and Australia could easily, by obligation, be dragged into an American skirmish that Australia has no business to be in?
I think that's right, and that's a really serious concern about this, apart from the lack of any due democratic process in developing this decision, and Labor essentially sticking with one of the last things that the previous government announced that they could easily have walked away from. Why they feel obliged to continue it, will forever escape me. But the technology will be completely dependent on the United States. The training will be completely dependent. The operating systems, the weapon systems will be completely derived from the US. It's already clear that they will need continuing staffing by particularly the first ones that will be acquired, the Virginia-class American submarines that will be purchased, whether off the already existing ones or new ones is not yet clear. But they will be completely dependent on United States technology and personnel for their operations.
With that level of dependence and indeed a loss of sovereignty, it's ironic that a defence spokesman said that it was a multi-generational nation-building exercise for the Australian people. It sounds to me more like a nation-building dismantling.
Yes, I think you're right. I mean, it's essentially will make this capability really beholden to the United States and perhaps later to the United Kingdom, although most of the guts of it it's essentially American technology in the propulsion systems and already clear in the weapon systems. They will be armed with Tomahawk cruise missiles from vertical launch tubes, American systems that used to be either conventional or nuclear capable, now only conventionally armed, but potentially, a new nuclear warheaded sea-launched cruise missile is back in this year's American defence budget. So everything about them, the technology that drives them, the expertise to build and maintain them. Australia has no capacity. Australia has no domestic nuclear industry, no nuclear power reactors. Its only real military nuclear experience is with a small research reactor that produces isotopes for science and medicine in Sydney, a reactor that was built in Argentina. Australia has no experience in managing the extremely sophisticated and complicated demands of bomb-grade uranium-fueled, highly enriched uranium-powered nuclear reactors. So we will be completely beholden, essentially, to the United States. And there's already, as we speak, a US nuclear-powered submarine in Perth. There will be $1 billion expended in expanding that base for essentially having US and UK nuclear-powered submarines on permanent rotation, starting quite soon. So a senior Chinese diplomat once told a colleague that it was not at the American bases in Australia that are of concern to China, it was that Australia is an American base. And I think that this really underscores the fact that de facto, from a military point of view, we are now really enmeshed and dependent as the sort of deputy sheriff in the South Pacific.
And these submarines aren't really going to be entering into service until what, the 2040s, the early 2040s. Given the pace of technological advance, isn't it likely that those very submarines are going to become obsolete by then?
I'm not an expert on submarine technology, but I certainly understand that there are significant developments and significant concerns about exactly that, of advances in the ability to detect submarines even deeply under the sea, that is likely to progress significantly over the next decade or two, that could make essentially submarines redundant. One of the ways that the government has said will avoid them becoming essentially redundant is by using them as launch platforms for unmanned underwater vehicles. But essentially that doesn't alter the potentially increasing vulnerability of submarines. The first submarines are likely to be acquired in the early 2030s. 2032 was mentioned for the first of the Virginia-class submarines from the United States that Australia will buy, and then the ones that we co-build, particularly with the UK, slated to arrive in the 2040s. Of course, that I think is still highly uncertain, but that's the plan.
So we really don't know for sure how long these things are going to be serviceable and what the consequences will be, obviously. I wonder, for example, with the anti-nuclear sentiment around much of the Pacific, you have the likes of Malaysia and Indonesia very worried about this development. What's it going to do to Australia's standing among the Pacific nations?
It's a good question, Wayne. I think it's not going to do us many favours. Commendably, most of the countries, essentially all of the independent ones that are able to, i.e. not the US or French-dominated territories of the Pacific, are very firmly anti-nuclear in their sentiment. They have the very bitter experience of the indiscriminate continuing legacy of over 300 nuclear tests conducted across the region with really scant regard for the health and safety of the populations that hosted them and the surrounding populations that were essentially all dusted with fallout on multiple occasions. There's a reason why there's a nuclear-free zone in the South Pacific and why 10 of the first 50 states that brought the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons into force were Pacific Island nations. So while they're trying to address climate change and seeking to address the nuclear legacy and joining the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, Australia is essentially going in a direction that has met a very hostile reception across the Pacific and also, as you mentioned, in Southeast Asia. ASEAN has also a nuclear weapons free zone. I think Australia is being rather presumptive in presuming that our nuclear-propelled submarines will be welcome to transit that zone at will.
New Zealand's made a pretty clear statement that Australian nuclear-powered submarines won't be welcome.
Absolutely consistent with the strongly held, now legally enshrined and widely supported bipartisan policy in New Zealand, commendably. I hope more countries take that example.
Well, here's a non-nuclear Australia at the stroke of a pen becoming alarmingly nuclearised. And how is that going to sit with the Australian public?
It's interesting, Wayne. There really hasn't been any public debate about this. It's now presented as a done deal and as a deal that both sides of the major parties that essentially are required to form government support. So, given the very long-term nature of the new build submarines, I think there has to be still some uncertainty about that actually coming off. But the opposition has so far been mainly around the ports on the eastern seaboard that are likely to host these, which have been mooted as either Newcastle, Port Kembla or Brisbane, Port Kembla being the one favoured by the Navy. There's certainly very active citizen opposition on the local council and opposition from local businesses who are concerned about the busy port that Port Kembla is, the prospect of it being a major site for construction of offshore wind turbines, all of this somewhat in jeopardy now because of the plan to put nuclear submarines there. But there's some things that Australia could do to essentially lessen the bad things about this and to really make it clear, as the government has proclaimed, but it's going to take more than a government proclamation to make this real, to prove and really establish firmly that these submarines are not the thin end of the wedge either for a nuclear power industry or for nuclear weapons to be stationed or, heaven forbid, acquired by Australia. Labor should fulfil its commitment, its national policy platform, to sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That would be the most effective way that it could ensure the region and the world that these nuclear-propelled submarines are not the thin end of the wedge towards nuclear weapons in Australia.
Couldn't it be argued that the whole development is in violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty?
That's another really important dimension of this, Wayne. There is actually a provision in the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreements that is the model that countries strike with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the International Nuclear Regulator, that was put in largely at Sweden and Italy's request when the treaty was negotiated in the 1960s, who both thought that they might want to keep their powder dry for nuclear-powered submarines. So there's a loophole in there that's never been used, but that does potentially allow nuclear material to be taken out of safeguards for a defined period for non-explosive military purposes, i.e. not weapons. And the intent was that applied to nuclear-powered submarines. But that requires a very detailed consideration by the IAEA. It requires the whole Board of Governors to really consider this very carefully. those who know the most about this, Tariq Rauf, who was head of verification at the International Atomic Energy Agency, for example, argues that essentially, while there is this provision, this loophole that's never been used, if the world is serious about non-proliferation, then instead of allowing this essentially as a precedent that will likely encourage other nations to acquire highly enriched uranium, ostensibly for submarine propulsion, potentially also for weapons, the far better thing than to blow that loophole open by driving nuclear-powered submarines through it would be to essentially to say that this loophole should not be used.
What's to stop any country hiding its highly enriched uranium or plutonium for weapon production when it comes to international inspection?
It's going to make it much harder. It's essentially impossible to verify the highly enriched uranium in a nuclear reactor on board a submarine that's designed to be in the deep ocean for many months at a time where nobody's supposed to know where it is. And with IAEA inspectors, with safeguards that are essentially designed for large fixed facilities on land, will have very limited access. It's essentially impossible to verify. And the US has previously denied this technology to countries like South Korea and Canada. That argument will now be very difficult to make. And already Iran has notified the International Atomic Energy Agency that it may require highly enriched uranium for exactly this purpose, submarine propulsion at some time in the future. This is essentially opening a Pandora's box of proliferation of weapons-grade material.
I was thinking about the argument that's been plastered over the popular press that it's planning for war. What are they really getting at here? I mean, the question has to be asked, why China's investing heavily in Australia if planning for war? It surely follows that it wouldn't be doing that if war was about to start in Beijing's books.
Yes, I would hope that much of the recent aggressive talk and posturing and more aggressive military exercises and overflights near Taiwan has been largely about Xi Jinping sort of establishing his credentials and sounding very tough prior to centralising power even further and renewal of his third term as Supreme Leader, which has just happened. One would hope that the long-term wisdom of China in not being an expansive imperial power would prevail. And certainly China economically, you would have to say, is doing much better around the world without military adventurism than just about anybody else.
At the same time, some people express alarm about China acquiring some unlikely new friends like Sri Lanka and the Solomon Islands.
Indeed. But, in a multipolar world, there is going to be these kinds of contestations. And I think it's going to be critical for all of our survival that powers like the United States learn to live in a multipolar world and don't risk nuclear war. War that commenced between Russia and the United States, or between the United States and China, between NATO and either of those, runs an extraordinarily high risk of escalating to use of nuclear weapons. And those who command and control nuclear weapons have told us repeatedly that once nuclear war starts, General Hyten, the director of US Strategic Command, said this most clearly recently: every military exercise that they run, when the nuclear threshold is crossed, it ends badly. It ends in all-out nuclear war. This is a risk that simply cannot be flirted with. This must be avoided at all costs.
And yet there's a lot of talk in the Australian media in recent days about regional nuclear conflicts, as if the fallout respected national borders.
Indeed, this is really ill-informed, non-evidence-based thinking to regard nuclear weapons as militarily usable in any localised sense. And there are essentially no small nuclear weapons. I mean, even the the tactical nuclear weapons that has been thought most likely for potentially Russia to use in its repeated nuclear saber rattling in Ukraine. These are weapons that range in size from just under Hiroshima size to sort of 6 or 7 times Hiroshima size, most of them being at the larger end. There are no small nuclear weapons, and from any practical perspective, it really doesn't matter what you call them. The same implications and the same indiscriminate, massive transboundary harm happens, whether they're tactical or strategic.
At this stage, is there any out? Supposing huge numbers of people walk through the streets of Sydney and Melbourne and protest the whole arrangement, and there should be plenty of people that are going to protest it. For example, traditional recipients of public spending grants, so many people connected with social programs that are going to take a massive hit for the next couple of generations. Aren't there going to be big demonstrations coming out of Australia about this that might send shudders in Canberra?
Well, I would certainly hope so, and I would certainly hope that many parliamentarians will be raising some very serious questions. But I fear that given the sort of high-level commitment that's now been repeated by new leaders, 2 of them different from those who made the initial announcement, there's a task force of 600 people already working on this in Defence and Foreign Affairs in Canberra. There are multiple senior ex-US military employees in the Australian defence establishment and providing highly paid advice for this program. Now that the coalition, the opposition, has chimed in with this plan, it's hard to see how it might be derailed at this end, particularly in terms of the Virginia-class submarine acquisition. For the longer-term, newly built and designed submarine, I think that's so far off with so many obstacles yet to overcome that there's likely to be greater uncertainty about that progressing. But I fear that given the investment of both sides of politics in this now, it will be hard to undo. Maybe curtail, maybe reduce the number of submarines. One thing that could very usefully be done to mitigate some of the harm would be for Australia to say that the new submarines that we design and build with the UK particularly and with US technology should be powered not by weapons usable highly enriched uranium, but by low enriched uranium, which doesn't have anywhere near the proliferation dangers. That's technically feasible. France and China already run nuclear-powered submarines on low-enriched uranium.
That's not going to wash with Washington, is it?
Well, I don't know. I think it potentially might have. There is already, I mean, it's contested, but there is already a program which received increased funding this year which has been going on for a number of years to investigate the conversion of US nuclear marine propulsion from highly enriched uranium to low enriched uranium. It's clearly technically feasible. I mean, the French and the Chinese already do it. If Australia had really made its continued participation in this plan contingent on that being the future development, that would significantly have reduced the global proliferation and precedent risks. That's a path that could still be taken for the new submarines.
That's a very interesting idea. And is it being talked about now in Australia?
I haven't heard much discussion of this yet. It's been certainly raised by some prominent folk in the United States, but no, it hasn't had anywhere near the discussion that it deserves here, because there has been essentially no public discussion about this.
Well, as we talk, the Pacific is looking less and less Pacific, isn't it? We're going to have nuclear submarines running around in in once non-nuclear waters. And on top of that, another thing that I know is very important, has been in your research, is the plans in Japan for 1.25 million tons of contaminated wastewater from the dysfunctional nuclear power plant going into the Pacific.
Yes, this is another nuclear issue, but certainly an equally regrettable plan that Japan seems stuck with. It's the really cheapest and dirtiest, out of sight, out of mind. Dilution is the solution to pollution.
What a green light for other nuclear powers to tip their own waste in the same way.
Exactly, that belongs in a previous century. And it really flies in the face of previous commitments by the Japanese government not to conduct such radioactive waste dumping without the clear support and agreement of Pacific Island countries. This has really been inadequately assessed. It's a fraught plan. And of course, it highlights that nuclear activities of whatever kind have serious risks of transboundary and transgenerational releases and accidents and consequences. Submarines, just as much as nuclear reactors, there are at least 8 nuclear-powered submarines that are not intentionally, but because of fires, explosions, storm damage, mishaps with weapons that are rusting on the bottom of the ocean. No technology is accident-prone, and these are going to be both increase every port that hosts these in Australia or constructs them is going to be a high priority nuclear target for adversaries. Yes, unfortunately, the nuclear legacy is very much being exacerbated rather than being remediated.
Well, in a world that's going to be facing food security issues for one reason or another, this is going to affect on the marine life, of course, and pelagic fish. And it's a health hazard, just as nuclear weapons are a grave health hazard. Where's the World Health Organization?
WHO, I have to say, although a crucial and really important organisation that does incredibly important work for us all, is lacking in resources, leadership and capacity in a number of critically important areas. And one of them is the whole sort of radiation and health field. It has ceded far too much of this space that properly belongs in its domain to the International Atomic Energy Agency, which of course has a conflicted mandate structurally in its statute. It's both the regulator and the police for ensuring that nuclear activities remain peaceful and aren't used for diversion to weapons. But it also promotes peaceful uses of nuclear energy, so-called. So it's intrinsically conflicted, and that's why we've seen such misinformation and biased information from the International Atomic Energy Agency, for example, about the consequences of the Fukushima disaster and about Chernobyl. And it has very perfunctorily given its approval for this discharge, not even addressing the scientific questions raised by an independent panel appointed by the Pacific Islands Forum, and in fact cutting off communication with that panel. So there is a serious problem in the international agencies that are tasked with nuclear and radiation-related responsibilities in terms of both their mandates and their capacity. And unfortunately, WHO, since landmark reports on nuclear weapons and their effects on health and health services in the 1980s, has been largely missing from both the evidence base that we need to inform nuclear policy as well as the field of radiation and health.
Well, in your own organisation, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, in the 1980s, it was a huge movement with so many medical people worldwide participating in annual conferences and no doubt heightening public awareness of the catastrophe of a nuclear exchange. And yet now we know that the risks are greater than ever before. The organisation has a much smaller membership, and generally the public isn't nearly as nuclear conscious as it was back then.
You're right, Wayne, and I think there's a really misplaced sense of complacency, really, since the end of the Cold War, essentially. To think about nuclear weapons is awful. It's confronting, it's difficult. It's not a nice thing to do. So, our psychology is such that we're good at denial and rationalisations.
Cognitive dissonance.
And cognitive dissonance. And much of the world, breathed a massive sigh of relief at the end of the Cold War, thinking, thank goodness we don't have to worry about that anymore, and this problem is now essentially done and dusted. I hope that the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the terrible nuclear risks that have accompanied it, both in terms of explicit threats to use nuclear weapons and bring the two opposing sides with the largest nuclear arsenals and all of the nuclear weapons on high alert into direct confrontation, but also the risk of a radiological disaster from a damaged or attacked nuclear power plant, as we've seen most graphically in Zaporizhzhia. But these dangers have not gone away. And as you've mentioned, all the authoritative assessments, the doomsday clock this year, I guess, being the best known of them, moved further forward in late January than it's ever before been at 90 seconds to midnight, principally because of the failure of disarmament and the increasing risks of nuclear escalation, intentional or otherwise, around Ukraine. It would be impossible for anybody to argue now, if you're watching anything that's going on in the world, to be lulled into a false sense of security that nuclear weapons are done and dusted. We have saved the world before. It was really popular pressure and the evidence of the catastrophic consequences of any use of nuclear weapons that convinced Reagan and Gorbachev to essentially end the Cold War and almost agree to eliminate their nuclear arsenals entirely. We need to do that again. We need to it's really public pressure that, as well as enlightened leadership, that is how good things happen. We're severely lacking on the latter. We need public pressure more than ever.
Well, we know that the Australian program is going to go on into the early 2050s, and the world's going to be a vastly different place politically and socially then. We've seen the breathtaking speed with which what we thought were established democracies falling to authoritarian leadership before the public can even blink their eyes. And if a Bolsonaro or somebody like the Hungarian leadership come along and really assert their authoritarian colours, they're going to inherit a ready-made nuclear arsenal, and God help us all.
Exactly. And, we've seen how fragile ostensible democracies are with the Trump administration in the United States. I mean, the insurrection that invaded the Capitol on January 6, 2021, came very close and was targeting the capture of the Vice President, Mike Pence, with the nuclear football, the suitcase containing the nuclear codes. These are profound risks. Ban Ki-moon, when he was UN Secretary General, said something prophetic that really, I think, sums up the situation very aptly. There are no right hands for the wrong weapons. And political institutions, human beings, are fallible and can change on a dime. We simply need to take the tools of doomsday out of harm's way, essentially, so that no human being should have the capacity to obliterate the world in an afternoon.
Well, Tilman, finally, I'm thinking of the post-apocalyptic science fiction book that became the film, On the Beach. It was set in 1964, and Melbourne, Australia, your Melbourne, was the last city to survive. I wonder if you see Melbourne any differently these days with the nuclear cloud hanging over it.
That was an iconic and book and film, I think, that stimulated many people to think about the importance of this issue and address the problem of nuclear weapons. I'm thinking particularly Helen Caldicott, a famous Australian physician and really a leading global advocate for nuclear weapons abolition who was really moved by reading on the beach when she was young. That scenario of essentially bright sunny days, waiting, doomed people waiting for the radioactive fallout to arrive and lead to their demise, we now know is not what would happen. Essentially, the climate impacts of even regional nuclear war are very clearly what would cause the greatest global toll. Burning cities ignited by nuclear weapons, lofting millions of tons of sooty smoke high into the atmosphere, where it would heat, stabilise, circle the globe, and cool, darken and dry the climate beneath, decimating agriculture and causing orders of magnitude more people to starve than even the horrendous casualties from the initial nuclear blasts. So unfortunately, our climate is connected worldwide, as we well know these days. And so the consequences of the major consequence of nuclear weapons in terms of human and ecological consequences, nuclear winter and nuclear famine, would essentially not spare any part of the globe.
And finally, looking back at AUKUS again, I did want to ask you very briefly, this is of course the UK, Australia and the US. Why wasn't Canada invited to be part of that as a Pacific nation as well? And what about New Zealand?
Very interesting question. Well, I think New Zealand's commendable, world-leading, visionary, moral, anti-nuclear policies and consistency would have precluded it from something that was always intended to have significant nuclear dimensions. For Canada, which has previously sought and been denied by the US acquisition to nuclear submarine propulsion, an interesting question. It is a really retrograde kind of white boys club, this kind of Anglosphere. It has seriously racist undertones and underpinnings, I think. And it really sort of, for Britain, a nation that essentially abandoned, military involvements east of Suez 60 plus years ago, it's pretty ironic to be drawn back in now into this white boys club. Why it was so exclusive, I don't know. Perhaps Canada had more sense. I don't know.
Well, Tilman, that's where we'll have to leave it. Thank you very much for your time. A bombardment of ideas and thoughts that for people to mull over. And I hope we can talk with you again soon.
Thank you very much, Wayne. I'd be delighted.